John, it's an honour to be here with you and with Tony, and it's fantastic to be here in Canada with this incredible sense that the Conservative Party is not only resurgent but poised for victory. That's I'm just going by what the polls are saying, right? I'm not saying anything controversial here. It would far be it from me to come and intrude into domestic politics of a friendly country, but I observe that, and wouldn't it be wonderful if this dynamism of this Canadian Conservative can somehow communicate itself to the UK? In this sense, maybe it will. We still have time, in spite of some of the gloomy things that you've just said about conservatism in the UK and Brexit and so forth. Maybe things will be all right. I just want to say, on your point about Ukraine, John, very, very quickly. Actually, I think Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House of Representatives, is in favour of passing the supplemental. I think Mike, as far as I understand the matter, is pro-Ukraine, right? And I think most of the Republican Party certainly is. They have a wing that isn't. What I would say to the skeptics about Ukraine is, if you're worried about the rise of autocracies around the world, as Tony and I certainly are, and I know you are, if you're worried about the long-term ability of America to remain the superpower, if you're worried about democracy around the world, if you're worried about security, then investing in the security of Ukraine is the most cost-efficient thing you can possibly do. There isn't. Mike, I would say, Mike, my cousin Mike Johnson, long lost, separated from. I would say, Mike, there aren't any American boots on the ground in Ukraine, and yet those Ukrainians are fighting for freedom and security everywhere, for the whole Euro-Atlantic area. America is currently investing in supporting the Ukrainians about 5% or less of their annual defense spending. It is a fantastically efficient way of supporting freedom. And by the way, most of the money, I would also say, to Mike and to all Republican friends and colleagues, most of that money is, of course, going to American jobs, American companies that are involved in the defense industry. I would say, if you want to send a signal to China, that it would be a huge mistake to think about making a move across the states of Taiwan, then make sure that Ukraine wins. But fundamentally, what I would say is, if you are the party of Ronald Reagan, if you want to make America great again, then you don't begin a new Republican presidency, which may well happen. You don't begin that by conceding victory to Vladimir Putin and letting the Ukrainians lose. And it would be a disaster. It would be a disaster for the West, and it would be a disaster for America. So those are some of the points I can make. Apart from anything else, Ukrainians are a free, sovereign, independent European nation, and what has happened to them is criminal and barbaric, and for humanitarian reasons alone. I would leave this point to last, because all the other reasons I have advanced are basically in America's national interest. I would leave that point to last, but I think it is, frankly, the most important.
Well, that was a very strong statement, and I know that you broadly agree with it, Tony, but could you perhaps expand on your take?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Boris. It's wonderful to be here, and yes, it's great to see the Canadian Conservatives looking like you're on the verge of a great win, a win which will encourage your fellow Conservatives all around the world. So it's great to be here in Canada. Look, we have to be absolutely crystal clear. The Ukrainians aren't just fighting for their own freedom, they're fighting for everyone's freedom. If Putin wins, at the very least, there will be a new Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe, and the enemies of freedom everywhere will be emboldened. The commissars in Beijing will be emboldened. The apocalyptic Islamists in the Middle East will be emboldened. So this really is a critical moment for the West, and the last thing we should be doing is effectively forcing the Ukrainians to capitulate by refusing to give them the weaponry they need, not just to survive, but to win. And this has been the problem. Too many people have not been prepared to give the Ukrainians the weapons they need to do the job they want to do for their own country's future survival.
Yeah. Well, whilst I completely share the hopes and expectations you both expressed and the strong defence of Ukrainian nationhood, the fact is all our hopes and expectations rest on the success of the Ukrainian army. Yeah. We wouldn't be having this conversation if Putin had succeeded in seizing Kiev in the first couple of weeks. And there are reasons we now have to face, it seems to me, at least as I read the material accounts of what is happening on the front, with two discouraging thoughts. The first one is that the sheer numbers of the Russians whom Russia can, in a sense, send out as soldiers, greatly outnumbers the sheer number of Ukrainians. And that's a factor. And the second factor is Russian production of munitions and armaments of all kinds is proceeding much more rapidly than American production of weapons. And so, concentrating for the moment solely on Ukraine, how are we going to deal with the fact that it looks as though Russia might be able to defeat the Ukrainians, but it cannot defeat NATO if NATO does nothing more than stay where it is, so how do we deal with that? And that then leads to a bigger question of what we do in the post-war world, because after all, the Russians are now leading us in the production of weapons, and well, if we're not using our own manpower to fight this war, what's going to happen?
Can I come back? Because I just think there's a risk that we will forget in this kind of conversation, which all this stuff about Putin's so strong, there's so many Russians, they think back to the Second World War. It's an illusion. The Soviet armies did extraordinary things in the Second World War, but don't forget that 11 million of them were Ukrainians, right? They killed a lot of Nazis, those Ukrainians. And they are a formidable fighting force. I think a couple of years ago you might have said that Putin had the second most powerful military in the world, and now I think you might say that Putin has the second most powerful military in Ukraine. and I mean that seriously. The Ukrainians have kicked the Russians out of more than 50% of the territory that Putin first took. They have destroyed about 40% or more of the Black Sea Fleet. And although it's true that Putin is doing fresh mobilizations, the Ukrainians have done prodigious damage to Putin's military capability, and they continue to do so. What they have lacked, as you rightly say, John, is the kit. And we throughout this last 2 years, we persist in giving them the right stuff at the wrong time. In other words, too late. The tanks, we said we began with 6 months a year. I can't remember how long it was. We said, it would be incendiary, it would be escalatory to give the Ukrainians tanks. We finally gave them tanks. We said, no, we can't give them the ATACMS, we can't give them the HIMARS, the long-range fires, the deep fires that they need. We're finally giving them. The lesson is that the Ukrainians will do the job if we give them the tools. Let's give them the tools. And the most important thing, we must, there's a lot of propaganda out there, there's a lot of negativity that, and you see it on some of the, I'm sad to say, even on the conservative networks in the United States. You see this stuff that is basically taking the Putin line. It is completely wrong. Putin fundamentally, disastrously miscalculated in 2022. He misunderstood what Ukraine is. He believed his own nonsensical Wikipedia cum Nostradamus nonsense when he said that Ukraine wasn't a proper nation. The Ukrainians have overwhelmingly refuted that point of view. They have shown that they are a proud, independent nation, and they are going to fight for freedom. And as our American friends could testify, when you get into a war of independence, wars of independence tend to end one way. What we need to do is keep supporting Ukraine, keep supporting freedom, and that, I believe, should be the Conservative position around the world. And in the end, and in the end, and it can't happen immediately, I fully accept that, but in the end, the resolution to this problem is the security and the stability that comes with certainty about where Ukraine is and what Ukraine is. And Ukraine has chosen to be a free, independent European nation oriented towards the West, towards the EU, towards NATO, and Ukraine must join NATO. That is the only logical way through this. And we say, well, we mustn't provoke Putin. Sorry if this is a long answer. Oh, we can't, there's a risk of provoking Putin. Well, we tried that. We tried not having Ukraine in NATO with a view to avoid provoking Putin, and look where that left us, with the worst war in Europe for 80 years. NATO is the body, NATO is the pact that gives certainty and stability and will bring peace. But in the meantime, give those Ukrainians what they need. Anyway, I could go on for a long time, but Canada has been fantastic so far. If I had to, I mean, I think now is the moment for an even more robust posture. And I think that goes for my country as well. I think we all need to recognize that the world is more uncertain, more dangerous. We all need, frankly, to be spending more on defense. And that goes for the UK as well as everybody else.
Let me just say that one thing the Ukrainians proved, and they proved it early on, is that they persuaded NATO not to be afraid of the Russians anymore. They suddenly didn't seem to be that powerful. But of course, in return, we have to provide the weapons that will make a continued fight a realistic proposition. And so I'm just going to ask Tony if he has anything to add on this particular point. But then, if you would, to go on to the wider argument about the post-war world, because, Boris, you just rightly said we need to spend more on defense. And it looks as though we're going to be facing at least two major powers, Russia and China, in a world sense, and maybe more because they have other allies as well.
Well, the only way that smaller countries can be secure against much larger, very aggressive countries is through collective security. The reason why Western Europe survived the Cold War, indeed flourished through the Cold War, was because of the protection that it was given through the NATO alliance. Once the current fight is over, NATO must be given, Ukraine must be allowed into NATO, must be given NATO equivalent guarantees. And similarly, if we are to avoid a Chinese assault on Taiwan, the Beijing regime needs to understand that an attack on Taiwan would not just pit 1.4 billion Chinese against 25 million Taiwanese, but would pit China effectively against the world, but certainly against a strong alliance of democracies.
I think I can sum up this particular bit of the part of the conversation with a joke by Konstantin Kisin, who was talking to one of his relatives in Russia, in Moscow, who said, a friend had come by and said, have you heard the news? No, what is it? We're at war with NATO. How are we doing? Well, we've lost these ships, these numbers of men, these munitions, these tanks, huge amounts. And what about NATO? Oh, NATO hasn't shown up yet. And the truth of the matter is that NATO can win this war, but it has to show up in some way or other. I'd like to move on now to the other big issue of war and peace, which is, of course, what's happening in Israel. and what's happening in Gaza. Today I hear the news that the ceasefire, which everybody has been trying to create and shape together, has been rejected by Hamas. I haven't heard anyone denouncing Hamas for rejecting the ceasefire or pressing them to do so. So it does appear from where we sit here, at least where I sit, that the people who are agitating in the streets for a ceasefire would like one from Israel without one from Hamas. Yeah. And so what I'd like to do now is ask really two related questions. First of all, I'll begin this time with Tony. How would you describe the fact that we seem in our Western countries to be more critical of our enemy, of our friends, than of our enemies, again and again and again? And what can we do in this particular case to deal sensibly but strongly with the upsurge of anti-Semitism that has accompanied the battles in Gaza in our own countries?
Well, the first point to make, I think, John, is that this kind of we support every country but our own sense is not new. I mean, if you go back to the time of Munich, Chamberlain was tough on the Czechs but soft on the Germans, and so demanding stuff of Israel that we would never demand of Hamas is, in a sense, in that same tradition. But it's hard to avoid the conclusion that there are two factors at work here. The first is a recurrence of the world's oldest prejudice, anti-Semitism, and the second is a kind of quasi-Marxism which sees the whole world in terms of oppressors and oppressed, and the Israelis have somehow become the oppressors and the Gazans are somehow the oppressed, even though Israel is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East, even though Israel is a place where speech is free, where LGBTIQ people can flourish. You've got the weird phenomenon of queers for Palestine when if they were in Gaza, the chances are they would be at risk of being tossed off a tall building. So we just have to be, I think, absolutely crystal clear where the right and the wrong is here. And we've got to be on the side of liberal democracy, and we've got to be against an evil, totalitarian, apocalyptic Islamism represented by Hamas. And frankly, the best thing we can do for the Palestinian people is do everything we possibly can to help Israel to destroy Hamas, because in the end, Hamas is a deadly enemy of the Palestinians as well as a deadly enemy of the Jewish people.
Thank you. Before I turn to Boris, could I just use the microphone to tell the organisers that the electronic clock facing me is not working, so unfortunately we
obviously we've only done 1 minute. Fantastic. We have them in our thrall, John. They can't escape.
Over to you.
Well, no, I passionately agree with what Tony has just said, and I went, as I'm sure others in this room have done, I went to see the kibbutz in Kfar Aza that had been the subject of one of the massacres on October the 7th, and I saw the horror of what had happened, the bloodstains on the walls, the pitiful signs of the struggle by totally innocent civilians, families. And just bear in mind that if you protracted the numbers of Israelis, of Jewish people who died on that day, and you imagined that it had happened in the UK, it would have been thousands and thousands, 10,000, many more than 10,000 people, right? Now, what would any elected prime minister do in those circumstances? What do you do when 10,000 of your population have been murdered in a terrorist attack? Of course, you have to find the people who did it, and you have to make sure that they can't do it again. That's your fundamental. That is what you're elected to do. You're elected to protect your population. That's your number one job. And of course we all deeply, our hearts bleed at what is happening in Gaza. It's horrendous and nobody wants it to happen. But remember who set it on. And who's
using civilians as human shields.
Exactly the point I was going to make, because the strategy of Hamas clearly was to provoke Israel into the type of retaliation which they're bound to do to prevent it happening again, in the knowledge that Israel would be obliged to attack civilian targets, because that is where the Hamas operatives have stationed themselves. And they knew, of course, that the Western world would find it difficult after a while to stomach the consequences of what Israel was forced to do. They knew it would be a propaganda disaster for Israel. I'm absolutely convinced of this. And I'm afraid that to a great extent we are falling for it. And our populations large numbers of people are falling for it. And it really dismays me to see suggestions now from good, kindly, well-intentioned people that countries like the United Kingdom should respond 6 months after the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Second World War, should respond by, with 130 hostages still missing, by the way, including a baby of 1 year old, I think, we should respond to this by banning arms sales to Israel. I mean, the logic of that on Kantian principles, I think, John, is if we act, we must believe that everybody should ban arms sales to Israel, and we must therefore believe that Israel should be deprived of the means to defend itself and its people, and therefore, logically, what we seem to be saying by that action is that we're willing to see Hamas win. And I got to tell you, I think that would be a disaster for the world. And does anybody really, when they stop to think, want that to be the outcome, want Hamas to be able to do this again and again, the Hydra heads of Hamas to sprout again? Is that what they want actually, is that what the Arab states want? It's the last thing they want. So look, this is a tragedy. It's what happened to the aid convoy was appalling, but remember who bears responsibility for this. And Tony was totally right. The moral difference is clear. The moral difference is clear. At every stage, as far as I can see, Israel and the IDF have done their best to minimize civilian casualties, minimize suffering, and Hamas, as far as I can see, are trying to maximize suffering. And unless we keep that moral clarity, we are really going to lose the plot here, folks. Yeah. So I'm very impressed by the way the Conservative Party of Canada has the moral clarity and the firmness of purpose that you've shown. And we just need to stick with it.
Yeah, the same thing, John, is now starting to happen with Israel in Gaza, as started to happen earlier with Ukraine and Russia. We've got to understand that if you're in a war, you're in it to win, not to draw. And you've got to beat your enemies, not, as it were, draw with your enemies. And it's almost like we don't really want Ukraine to win. We want Putin to save face. We don't really want Israel to win. We want Hamas to save face. But how can you want an apocalyptic death cult to save face? There's only one way to deal with an apocalyptic death cult. It's to get rid of it.
Let me just say two quick things. One is that if what you both said is correct, and obviously everybody here seems to agree with you, it's an extraordinary commentary on international bodies and organizations today that the UN Security Council passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire, but not calling for the release of the hostages by Hamas. So this is, we are living in a very odd, morally odd time in the world. There was a second point, but the one point I think I would urge you to consider when looking at the attitudes of US Republicans is that their argument includes the idea that we have had too many unwinnable wars and we don't want another one. I agree with both of you that this is not an unwinnable war, but the fact is in the past we have had too many of them, and that's an understandable
that's exactly
point
right.
of view.
And how many American casualties have there been in Ukraine? Zero.
Zero,
Now,
that's right.
I mean,
zero,
Yeah.
well, that brings us on to another topic, Boris. Well, we might disagree. But
Well, this is the next. This is the next thing, because I'm moving on to net zero. We don't have a lot of time, so we have to move on. And I'm going to begin, Boris, with you, because you made net zero or almost a flagship policy of your administration after Brexit. And my question to you is this: if net zero is a policy that you passionately believe in and want to succeed, how do you deal with the fact that the sacrifices it requires and calls for are just not going to be given, not going to be accepted by the electorate? And that's becoming clearer every day. And furthermore, it's hard to justify those sacrifices when, in the case of Britain, for example, we're responsible for less than 1% of world carbon emissions. And secondly, in the case of the British, they are contributing so little compared to what the Chinese and others are.
Okay, so first of all, I've been on a like many people in this room, possibly. I was a massive climate change skeptic when I used to write terrible things, which you can find in my. I used to say.
That's why we like you.
I used to say that wind power. I used to say that you could forest the whole of Britain with wind power and it wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, and all those kind of things. And I didn't believe in the big science. So I have got to tell you. So I got the scientists in both when I was in City Hall, when I was Mayor of London, and then when I became Prime Minister. And I really put them through their pace. And in the end, I thought, well, look, here's what I really think about this. It's possible it's a load of nonsense, but it's also possible, and I've got to be humble. I gave up. Under our brilliant educational system in the UK, I did no science after the age of, I think, about 13. So I had to be humble in the face of what these scientists were telling me. They were saying that the graphs were absolutely certain. And so I said, right, I'm going to take a bet, a Pascal's wager. You remember Pascal's wager? I said I'm going to believe in this because if I'm wrong, I haven't really lost anything much. Yeah. If I'm right, then it will have saved humanity a great deal of, or saved the population a great deal of misery. Because clearly, if you have an exponential warming of the world, it could be very, very serious indeed. And I thought hang on. I thought the way forward, and this is where I think there is common ground. The way forward is Vorsprung durch Technik, as we say. It's technology. You've got to show that the green agenda is going to produce jobs and growth. And if you can't show that as Conservatives, then you ought to pack up and go home. And I think it can. And actually, we massively reduced emissions in the UK. When I was Mayor of London, we reduced CO2 by about 20%, and GDP continued to rise. And by the way, you mentioned Brexit, which I think you said something gloomy about Brexit earlier on, John. Since Brexit, let me remind you that the UK has actually outgrown most European economies. GDP, in spite of the huge cuts we've made in CO2 emissions in the UK, which we have, huge cuts, GDP has continued to rise very, very satisfactorily. And all I would say to you is there is a conservative way through these dilemmas which accepts that hydrocarbons have to have a role, and that probably we underestimated that role in our excitement about achieving net zero. The reality is we're going to have to be more reliant on them than we thought. But as Conservatives, I don't think that we can afford simply to say to the public, to young people who really care about this, that we're junking the whole agenda. Because let me tell you, elections are won by the party that really owns the future. And as I say, I'm full of excitement about what's happening here in Canada. But I think that people want to see that there's a plan and a program to deal with this problem in a proper Conservative way. And so I make absolutely no apology for championing nuclear power, many more nuclear reactors, trying to make sure that the UK consumer was not wholly dependent on Chinese imports of battery powered cars, but we were making them ourselves. I make no apology for trying to do that. I want a green revolution that delivers jobs and growth in the UK. I do believe that's possible. I do think that you can square the circle, have a policy for net zero, which we may not achieve it by 2050, but unless you're willing to go in that direction, unless you show the public, who by the way do care about this issue, who do worry. Well, I think they do.
No. Now, I think
anyway, Tony, tell them why it's all nonsense and why you don't mind. Well, you don't mind if we're all going to fry. I mean,
Boris,
okay.
Last time I was in Ottawa, it was minus 15 degrees, and I thought maybe turning the temperature up a couple of degrees wouldn't be a bad thing.
I know. I think Canada might. I was flying out. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's barely spring here. What's going on? But I think you could definitely do with global warming here. But then,
but Boris, did you ask the scientists how they explained the ice ages and how they explained?
I did. I tried all that.
But seriously,
no. I said, what about the medieval warming period?
And the Roman warm period.
England
and
under
the mini
Romans.
ice age.
I said,
England under the Romans was a very warm place. It was wonderful.
Tony's right. Under the 11th century, we were very warm. Under the Romans, we produced a huge amount of wine. I tried all that. They sneered at me, Tony.
And you should not have been put off by their scorn. You should have persisted with the cross-examination. But truly, there are obviously...
I don't have your scientific confidence, Tony.
But there are obviously factors in climate change way beyond mankind's carbon dioxide emissions. Because if mankind's carbon dioxide emissions were the only things that mattered, we would never have had the ice ages. We would never have had previous periods of climate change. Now, I want to make 3 points. First, there is no climate emergency. Second, it's far from clear that mankind's carbon dioxide is the only or even the main factor in climate. And third, trying to turn the world upside down in order to reduce our emissions to zero by a particular date, I just think is folly of the first order. The truth is that so far, the green agenda has given us much higher power prices, and in the process we have effectively deindustrialised by exporting most of our emissions-intensive industries to countries which are less fastidious about this than we are, at least one of whom, China, is our great geopolitical competitor. Now, Boris, I absolutely accept that we have to be realistic, but can I tell you, my mantra when I was Prime Minister was this, that climate does change, that we have to accept that mankind might be making a difference, and we should try to reduce emissions as far and as fast as we can.
I think we agree.
But not if it means big job losses,
No.
the end of manufacturing industry in this country, and massive attacks on people's cost of living. And can I tell you, I won a thumping majority fighting on this policy. In three Australian elections, climate change has been a big issue. In 2010, in 2013 and in 2019, and in every one of those elections, the party that won, or party that did best, was the more sceptical party, the more realistic party. The party said, we are certainly not going to economically hamstring our country by failing to mine coal, by failing to export gas, by failing to explore for fossil fuels. And the truth is that everyone wants to save the only planet that we have got, but the idea that we should impose massive costs on our citizens, costs that our competitors, rivals and enemies are not bearing, it's simply crackers.
Well, I think I want you to know, I also won a thumping majority.
I want to keep driving a V8 car. I want to see coal mines and gas fields continue.
I also won a thumping majority because
that was on Brexit, Boris.
Because they
that
knew,
was on taking back
knew
control.
that I agreed
that
with
was
Tony.
on letting Britain be Britain.
No, because there were many reasons, but I think they also listened to what I had to say about emissions, which turns out to be exactly what Tony Abbott believes, which is that we should reduce emissions. Did you hear him say that? Yes. He said we should reduce. Look, the reality is that sensible.
The reality is we have 7 minutes left, and we have to move on to the next topic.
Tony Abbott said it himself that man-made climate change is a problem. You heard it. He said. He said it. Maybe he now wishes he hadn't, but he did.
No, come on, please.
He's saying that we should
to
reduce emissions. I happen to agree with him. There is far more that unites us and divides us.
Well, I think we have to move on. Otherwise. And the question now is, when we started this, I mentioned the Unite the Right movement that brought about major change in this country. It looks to me as though there is the problem of the divided right in all of the countries of the Anglosphere and a lot of other countries too. The state of conservatism is fractured, it seems to be. And I'd like to ask, and I'll start this time with Tony, how you think on what terms we should try to unite the right internationally and, so to speak, in Britain and elsewhere.
Okay, well, we start off by knowing what we stand for. John Howard used to say, and John Howard is the most successful living Conservative in my country, he used to say that the Liberal Party, which is the Conservative Party in Australia, effectively we are the political custodian of the small L Liberal tradition of J.S. Mill and of the small c Conservative tradition of Edmund Burke. That's what Howard used to say. I used to say that as Liberals, we support smaller government, lower taxes, greater freedom. As Conservatives, we support the family, small business and institutions that have stood the test of time. But above all else, as patriots, we believe that our country is the best place on earth to live, and we want to keep it that way. So we are the Freedom Party, we are the Tradition Party, but above all else, we are the Patriot Party, and that is why, if we are true to ourselves, we should be the natural party of government.
Well, I passionately agree with all of that. I would try and boil it down even more and say, you know, the difference between us Conservatives and and our opponents is that every time their instincts are always about control and expropriation and coercion and taking your money and spending it on your behalf and regulating your lives, and we are on the whole in favor of freedom. And it's that single Anglo-Saxon idea of freedom that I think unites conservatives, or should unite conservatives. And when I look at some of the things that we're doing now, I think that are being done in the name of conservatism, I think they're absolutely nuts. And I see my own beloved party, which, as I say, I hope will be shortly infected with the great, or not infected, what's infused, invigorated, transfused with the Canadians' can-do spirit, and will turn things around in the next few months. But we're banning cigars. And what is? I mean, maybe you all think that's a great idea. I just can't see what is the point of banning? Well, the party of Winston Churchill wants to ban. I mean, donnez-moi un break, as they say in Quebec. It's just mad. And so it's free. And by the way, it's free to democratic societies. Freedom to say what you want.
Freedom to take risks.
Freedom to take risks. Freedom to invest your money how you choose. Freedom to spend your own money. Freedom to vote for whomsoever you choose. And to make sure that your vote matters. Those freedoms really matter. And they are contested around the world. They're not trivial. They're not banal. There are plenty of countries now which are restricting those freedoms.
And John,
and by the way, and Ukraine, sorry to get back to this, but Ukraine is, what's the difference between Ukraine and Russia? Russia is a tyranny where it doesn't matter who you vote for. In Ukraine, the outcome of the election is genuinely in doubt because it's a democracy. And we should be fighting for that. We should be supporting those guys.
We all agree, I think, with that. But
well, I hope we do, because
at the same time, our children in universities are not free to really pursue the course of their interests. There are the woke are everywhere.
Are you woke, Tony?
I'm awake.
Under the bed.
But John, this is where all of us have got to have a lot more courage. Courage.
Yes.
I mean, this is the problem about the modern world. Prudence is everywhere. Courage is nowhere. And we will die of prudence, honestly.
I agree with that, and I think the what's happening in universities, the restrictions on free speech, J.K. Rowling being demonized when she's probably done more to encourage young people to read around the world than any other person I can think of. I mean, she's a modern saint, and it's unbelievable what they're saying about her. And by the way, what's so crazy is what she says about gender is, of course, what 95% of the population secretly think, but don't have. To Tony's point, don't have the guts to say anymore because they're worried that they will offend somebody or somebody will jump down there.
It's a failure of authority as much as of freedom.
I know. Well, that's why I think both Tony and I should be back in power as soon as possible. There's not a day that goes by now where I don't think the world would be substantially improved if that were the case.
I'm a recovering politician, so don't offer me a chance to relapse, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are, I think, 36 seconds away from the end of this entertaining event.
Can I ask you a question, John?
I'm sorry.
Can I ask you a question, John?
Yes, of course.
I've always been an incorrigible Anglophile, and I believe that no country on earth has had more impact on the modern world than Britain. Why has Britain been tainted by a full century of defeatism and declinism, relieved only by Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, and for a brief shining moment, the guy sitting in the middle?
Well, not because of the common people, because they have been sound throughout this and rallied to defeat enemies whenever they were called upon to do so. I'm a little less happy today because during the COVID pandemic, the ordinary people did not rally to liberty. They rallied to control and regulation. And I think that safetyism is just the blunt end of a series of changes in the mentality of, but that mentality stems from the governors first, from the establishment and from the classes of people who give us instructions and like doing so. I don't quite know why the rest of us have gone along with it, why they haven't rallied more to rebelliousness. They have on occasions, but they haven't on a systematic basis. But that's up to you to solve, and I think it can only be solved by political... Sorry? Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Yeah.
I'm happy to say that I wrote a strong piece defending this Freedom Convoy and pointing out, and by the way, I'm the chairman here, I can't carry on, but I will just say I pointed out that this was a rebellion of the people who make and move things, as opposed to the people who order over the telephone or over the internet and expect these things to be delivered to their door, although they've had very precious little say in arranging for them to be made or moved. And I think that was a very serious change in the way in the way we are governed, and a very encouraging one. And I think these two gentlemen were the people whose ideas inspired that. But in the end, it had to be the people who did the moving.
And the people, I completely agree. Sorry, I know we're trespassing now into your time, but the people have greater wisdom, because I think to Tony's point, it is a mystery, given all that Britain has done, all that Britain has got to offer, how gloomy the British establishment, the British elites can be about their own ability to order things, and their constant genuflection towards what's going on in other countries. As they used to say in the 18th century, they order things so much better in France. But it's nonsense. It's not true. But it took the broad mass of the British people to see that was nonsense, and to vote for Brexit.
Here, here.
And they did the right thing. They will be vindicated by history, because they took back control. And they took back the freedom of the British people to manage their own affairs, which has served them well for centuries and centuries.
And served the wider world well.
And served the wider world too.
I mean, but for Britain, there would be no Canada.
Just one thing, and then we have to go. People sometimes say, what is the benefit of Brexit? The answer is Brexit. Brexit is the benefit of Brexit.
And the vaccine rollout the fastest in Europe by miles, and AUKUS, and an independent policy on Ukraine, and our ability to do AI differently, and new rules on just a huge range of things. Don't believe the negativity, folks.
It's not negative.
No,
it's not
I'm
negative
not saying you are.
at all.
No, you're great.
No. I mean, the fact is, those things might have happened under different regimes. The fact is, we made those decisions, and they were the decisions we wanted. Good decisions made by other people on our behalf, well, they're better than bad decisions, but they're not the ideal. Gentlemen,
yes,
you are both obviously heroes of a liberty-loving conservatism. We want more of it. We want you back. And so...